The wind howled like a wild beast. Rain lashed against leaves that crunched beneath their feet. Clara Evant stood ankle-deep in mud, her heart pounding as thunder roared overhead. She could hardly see Charles Armstrong in the darkness, though he was only a few steps in front of her. The swampy island stank of decaying plants. The air was hot and wet, and mosquitoes buzzed around them in thick clouds. Each step felt like it might sink them deeper into the unknown. Their clothes clung to their skin, heavy with mud and rain, and their spirits balanced between hope and dread. Somewhere in the murk, a low groan rose from the ground. It sounded like an animal, or perhaps the swamp itself, moaning in hunger. Clara's breath caught. Her mind raced with images of quicksand and creatures lurking under the surface. Charles clenched his fists, tension filling the narrow space between them. They had walked for hours, or so it felt, trying to find shelter. Exhaustion gnawed at Clara's mind, but she refused to give in. She had to keep going. If she stopped, fear would consume her. Lightning flashed, revealing half-sunken logs and gnarled tree roots that looked like twisted arms. They had found a small patch of dry land, ringed by ominous trees. Yet, the sense of safety there was slim. Every shadow played tricks on Clara's eyes. She blinked hard, trying to focus on Charles. He had offered her his arm to steady her, and she felt the trembling tension beneath his expensive dress shirt, now torn and muddy. They had slipped so many times that she had lost count. Each fall threatened to swallow them both whole. Charles turned his head, scanning the dark perimeter. "We should keep moving," he muttered, but Clara heard the unsteady shake in his voice. This was the mighty Charles Armstrong, the tech millionaire who commanded boardrooms and held an entire empire in his grip. Here, in the damp gloom, he was just a man, afraid and uncertain, clutching Clara's hand as if it were a lifeline. They had spent hours wandering after the yacht party disaster, stumbling through waterlogged paths, cut off from any sign of rescue. Gators could be watching, hidden in the black waters. Poisonous snakes or spiders might be waiting in the shadows. Yet the real terror, Clara thought, came from not knowing if they would ever make it out alive. She felt her pulse quicken again as thunder shook the sky. The deafening noise seemed to rip through the cloud bank. In that split second of bright lightning, Clara glimpsed Charles's face. His eyes were wide, but there was a fire inside them. He refused to give in to fear. She saw determination there, and something else, an intense longing that made her heart flutter. His gaze said, "I will protect you no matter what." But how had they come to this dreadful place? Both of them came from families with more wealth than they could count. They had grown up in comfort, shielded from life's basic struggles. Now they were thrust into the raw force of nature, fending for themselves. And though danger surrounded them, an even bigger storm brewed inside their hearts. Family feuds, secrets, and grudges had led them to this lonely swamp in the middle of nowhere. And in this dark corner of the world, they had only each other to cling to. The night dragged on. Rain hammered the trees, turning the ground into sticky black sludge. Clara's hair hung in wet clumps around her face. She tried to slow her breathing, but fear still clung to her lungs. She knew Charles was tired. She was too, but the pulsing energy between them never waned. It was as though every brush of his hand reminded them both that, despite their family's hatred, something powerful was blooming between them. Something that might change everything they had ever known. Then came a shrill noise in the distance, like a bird's cry, twisted by the wind. Clara froze, her legs feeling weak. She and Charles locked eyes. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but the sound repeated, cutting into the night like a warning. They had no idea whether it was an animal, a person, or the swamp itself letting out some eerie breath. Everything felt unknown, even themselves. In that moment, standing on the brink of chaos, both Clara and Charles realized that their old lives, the parties, the arguments, the boardroom battles, meant nothing. Here, on this savage island, survival took priority. Yet love, unexpectedly, had followed them, too. It glowed between them, even in the gloom. A week earlier, Clara Evant had dressed in a glittery gold gown for a yacht party that was supposed to showcase wealth and influence. It was a grand event hosted by the Evant family, or so the invitation said. In truth, the Evans and the Armstrongs had been locked in a long-running corporate feud that had spanned decades. That night was meant to ease tensions, or so everyone hoped. Clara, a celebrated surgeon who worked with advanced materials in her own small lab, was there to represent her family's side of the business. She arrived on the yacht, her heart pounding with nervous energy. "Clara, do you have any idea how many VIPs will be here tonight?" asked her father, Raymond Evant, just before they boarded. "I need you to mingle and show them that the Evans are not just about old money. We are the future, too." Clara nodded, but her thoughts drifted. She disliked these lavish events. She would have preferred to stay in her lab, working on new designs and helping philanthropic causes that her father scarcely cared about. But she was the daughter of the Evant patriarch, and she had responsibilities. The Evans had built their fortune in real estate and manufacturing, but now they were branching into tech. Charles Armstrong's family was also heavy into tech. Mergers, alliances, and a hint of sabotage had colored their history. That night might be the first step to bridging old grudges. The yacht was a gleaming white vessel, large enough to host hundreds of guests. Lights sparkled along its decks. A live band played near the stern, and servers bustled about with silver trays of champagne. Clara forced a polite smile. Inside, she felt uneasy, as if something big was about to happen. She had no idea how right she was. The air that evening was thick and warm. A storm brewed on the horizon, but no one seemed concerned. Rich guests laughed, dancing on the polished floors. Everywhere Clara turned, she heard talk of corporate deals and expansions. Yet she also heard hushed whispers about the Evant-Armstrong feud. Some guests were there out of curiosity, eager to see if these two powerful families might, at last, set aside their differences. Out of the corner of her eye, Clara spotted Charles Armstrong. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored suit that hugged his form. His dark hair was neatly combed, and when he saw her, he gave a nod. She held her breath. Charles was an heir to the Armstrong empire, but unlike many others, he had made his own name in the tech world. He had started from his father's platform, yet he had expanded in ways that dazzled industry experts. Everyone spoke of him as a man with unstoppable ambition and an eye for innovation. In her private thoughts, Clara had always found Charles fascinating. She had studied him from a distance, his speeches, his interviews. He spoke with passion about pushing technology to solve real human problems. Their families hated each other, but she could see that they shared a desire to do good with their fortune. That, at least, was a point of connection. Still, she doubted he would pay her much attention. They were supposed to be rivals, after all. To her surprise, Charles approached, a cordial smile playing on his lips. "Good evening, Ms. Evant," he said. "Quite a party your family has thrown." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "Yes, my father doesn't do anything halfway. I hope you're enjoying yourself." Charles looked out at the ocean. "Well, the night is young. I have a feeling something unexpected might happen." His voice held a slight edge of humor, but also sincerity. His words put Clara on edge. "Is that so?" He shrugged. "You know these events. Tensions can simmer under the surface. One push in the wrong direction, and the storm breaks." Clara tried to read him. Was he talking about the weather, or the feud, or something else entirely? Before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. It was Finn Marcotte, a rising star in the Armstrong family's legal team. He was known for being aggressive in business deals. Clara braced herself. "Charles, we need to talk about the new contract. Your father." Charles held up a hand. "We'll talk later, Finn. Right now, I'm enjoying the night." Finn's gaze darted to Clara, and a flicker of disdain crossed his face. Clearly, he did not trust her. Then he stalked off, leaving a tense air behind him. Charles sighed. "I'm sorry about that. Finn can be quite protective of the Armstrong interests." Clara shrugged. "It's fine. I'm used to it." She offered a small laugh. "I'm an Evant after all." Charles returned her smile. "Well, that's too bad. Because if you weren't, maybe we could skip all this rivalry. For a moment, They just stared at each other. Clara felt a strange flutter in her chest. She realized with a jolt that Charles wasn't just a name on a corporate ledger. He was a real man with real ideals. And there was an undeniable magnetism about him. She found herself wishing that their last names did not carry so much weight. As the night wore on, the yacht glided further from the coastline. Dark clouds gathered above. A shift in the wind made the sea chop against the hull. Lightning flickered in the distance. Yet, inside the party, people kept dancing and chatting, ignoring the warnings of the approaching storm. Soon, a flash of lightning struck closer, and thunder boomed across the waves. The sudden change in weather caused the yacht to rock violently. Glasses fell from tables, shattering on the deck. Guests gasped. Some rushed to find life vests. The music came to an abrupt stop. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers. He ordered everyone to remain calm. The crew would direct them to safety. But inside, panic was spreading. Clara felt her heart race as the vessel tilted. She gripped the railing and looked around for her father. Instead, she found Charles again, who reached her side in 2 quick strides. "Clara, come with me," he said firmly. "We need to get off the deck." She followed him as waves crashed over the sides of the yacht. Rain poured from the sky, soaking them both. The polished floor became slick. People screamed, clutching one another for balance. The boat's engine roared as the captain tried to steer through the churning sea. All around, the night turned black except for the bright streaks of lightning. Clara felt her body seize with fear. She had never been in such a dangerous storm. Charles placed his arm around her, guiding her toward the lower deck. Water splashed up to their calves. "Here," he shouted. "We can wait out the storm below." They stumbled down a short flight of stairs. But fate had other plans. As soon as they reached the lower deck, a sudden jolt threw them off balance. Clara crashed into a metal railing. The pain shot up her side, knocking the breath out of her. Before she could regain her senses, another huge wave slammed into the yacht, sending a wall of water over her head. She coughed, sputtering, trying to find Charles in the chaos. For a split second, she saw him gripping a rail, water streaming off his hair. Then more water poured in, and the yacht lurched again. Alarms blared. The force of the next wave shoved them both to the edge of the deck. Clara felt herself being swept away. Then everything happened at once. She sensed a pair of strong arms around her. Charles was trying to hold on to her, but the current was too powerful. With a final crash of thunder, the railing gave way, and both of them tumbled into the raging sea. The ocean was a wild dance of lightning and darkness. Clara struggled to keep her head above the swirling waves. Thunder exploded overhead, and each flash gave a terrifying glimpse of Charles flailing nearby, fighting to reach her. She felt something pinch at her ankle, a piece of floating debris, and panicked. She kicked it away, trying not to swallow more salt water. She heard Charles's voice roaring through the wind. "Clara, hold on to me." She felt his hand clamp over hers, pulling her closer. In the chaos, they managed to cling to a fragment of the yacht's wreckage. Hours seemed to pass as they drifted in the storm, battered by waves and battered by fear. At some point, Clara blacked out. When she came to, the ocean was calmer. The storm had passed, leaving only a faint drizzle. Her head pounded. Her eyes stung from the salt. She felt Charles near her, his arms still around her waist. He was breathing, though weakly. They floated on the remains of the yacht, which kept them half above water. She coughed, her throat raw. The sky turned lighter. Dawn was breaking. Clara squinted at a dark shape in the distance, a shoreline with dense trees. As the waves pushed them closer, her heart leapt. It was land, possibly an island, though it looked wild and unwelcoming. At that moment, it seemed like salvation. She nudged Charles. "Hey," she croaked. "Land, over there, we need to get there." Charles stirred, blinking water out of his eyes. He nodded, not speaking. With shaky limbs, they paddled the makeshift raft toward the island. The final stretch was the hardest. The tide pulled them this way and that, smashing them against rocks. Clara's arms ached with each stroke. She felt like giving up, but the sight of that muddy beach drove her forward. At last, they reached the shore. The sand was more like silt, soft and gray, dotted with twisted roots. Beyond it lay a swampy forest with looming trees and thick undergrowth. The air was warm and heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth. Exhausted, they collapsed onto the muddy ground, breathing hard. Clara lay there, feeling the grit of the island against her skin, not caring about anything but the fact that she was alive. She did not know how much time passed. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, Charles sat up, wiping seaweed from his hair. He gave Clara a weary smile. "We made it," he whispered. She managed a nod, tears burning her eyes. She thought of the yacht, of her father, of all those guests. What had become of them? Were there rescue teams searching the sea? She could not know. But for now, she and Charles were here, stranded on an unknown island, battered but alive. The sun climbed higher, cutting through the clouds. Warmth returned to the world, but the swampy ground made each step a messy slog. Clara and Charles walked inland, careful to note their path. They found a patch of somewhat higher ground, where they decided to rest and take stock of their situation. Clara shivered in her wet clothes. She wrung out her long hair and tried to gather her thoughts. "We need fresh water, shelter, and a way to signal for help," she said. Her voice was still raspy from the salt water. Charles nodded. "Yes, and we should also check if there's any fruit or edible plants. I'm not sure how long we might be here." The mention of indefinite stay sent a chill through Clara. Could they be stuck here for days, weeks? Her stomach cramped with hunger. She had lost track of time since the storm. At least the day was clear now, though the land still looked bleak. The trees were tall and dense, their roots forming swamp pools that teemed with insects. It was unlike any place Clara had ever seen. Over the next few hours, they searched for fresh water. They found a small stream trickling through a patch of dense foliage. They tested it carefully, deciding it might be safe to drink in small amounts. They also managed to gather some round, green fruits that looked a bit like unripe guavas. Charles cut one open using the shard of metal they had salvaged from their wreckage. It tasted sour, but it was better than nothing. As they took a short break, Charles studied Clara in silence. He noticed her trembling hands and the exhausted set of her shoulders. Yet he also saw the quiet determination in her eyes. He wondered how he had never truly spoken to her before. She was known to be a genius in advanced materials, something about new polymers that could revolutionize biotech. Her father had kept her somewhat hidden, letting her achievements speak for themselves without giving her a big role in the public side of the family business. "Are you holding up?" Charles asked gently. Clara forced a small smile. "As best as I can. This is new." She paused, picking at her damp clothes. I've never had to survive in a place like this." "Neither have I," Charles admitted. "But we'll figure it out together." His words comforted her. They shared a moment of warmth, though the situation was far from safe. Clara eyed the surrounding swamp. In the distance, the low hum of insects and the occasional splash told her there was wildlife nearby. They needed to be cautious. They decided to find a safer spot to set up a makeshift shelter before nightfall. As they walked, Clara realized that her feet were sinking more in certain areas. She had heard terrifying stories of quicksand or sinking mud. She stayed close to Charles, who tested the ground with a long stick. Their progress was slow, but they managed to avoid any major trouble. They picked a small rise in the land, under the boughs of a large tree. Its roots were thick and twisted, offering a bit of cover. Charles used branches and broad leaves to weave a lean-to, while Clara cleared the ground of sharp stones. When they finished, it looked pitiful, but it might keep some rain out if another storm came. By evening, they huddled together under their flimsy shelter. Their clothes were dry, but their hearts were heavy. Thoughts of the wreck, of the missing yacht, weighed on their minds. Clara remembered her father's stern gaze. Had he survived the storm? She told herself that Raymond Evant was a man of action. He would likely be found safe, or at least he would have teams searching for her. She closed her eyes, wishing for rescue. But doubt still crept in. Charles watched her, sensing her unease. He took off his damp jacket and placed it over her shoulders. "It's not much, but it might keep you a bit warmer." She nodded, grateful. A strange awareness passed between them. Their families might hate each other, but here and now, they only had one another to rely on. Clara noticed how Charles looked at her, with concern and a flicker of longing. She remembered the way he had protected her on the yacht, how he had clung to her in the raging sea. A soft warmth spread through her chest. She had always seen him as an arrogant businessman. Now, she saw a brave man who refused to abandon her. That night, as darkness fell, the island came alive with eerie noises. Insects buzzed, animals croaked in the blackness. Now and then, a mysterious splash echoed from the swamp. They had nothing but each other for comfort. Charles lay near her, and when Clara heard the rustle of movement nearby, she inched closer. He placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Don't worry," he whispered. "We'll make it through." She stared at him in the dim light, seeing his features softened by moonlight. In that fragile moment, she felt safe with him. Despite the fear of the unknown, she allowed her eyes to close, letting the lull of his steady breathing carry her off to an uneasy sleep. Morning came slowly. The sky was a washed-out gray, with new clouds rolling in. Clara and Charles emerged from their flimsy shelter, stiff and sore. Charles rubbed his neck, wincing. Clara tried not to think about how she must look, muddy and disheveled. But pride was a luxury here. They decided to explore more of the island to find higher ground or a better source of food. Moving carefully, they inched through the swamp. The mud sucked at their shoes, and they had to use sticks to help keep their balance. Clara spotted some fish in shallow pools, but they had no real means to catch them. They pressed on. All the while, thoughts of their families weighed on them. Clara recalled how her father had once mentioned an old betrayal by the Armstrongs. Rumor said that Charles's grandfather had swindled the Evans in a big deal. The Evans, in turn, had retaliated in a different venture. The cycle of hatred had continued for years, fueling whispers and boardroom drama. Clara never cared much about these grudges, but her father insisted it was important to remember who their enemies were. Charles was lost in his own thoughts. He had always known about the friction between the Armstrongs and the Evans. Sometimes he felt smothered by it. The two families were powerful, and their wealth fed their resentments. Charles just wanted to build technology that could help people. The rivalry got in the way. But now, alone with Clara, he began to question many things he had assumed. She was not the manipulative Evant he had been warned about. She was strong, warm-hearted, and genuine. The feud felt more and more like an old ghost haunting them for no reason. As they trudged through swamp water up to their knees, Clara slipped on a submerged branch. She nearly fell face first into the murk, but Charles caught her arm and pulled her up. She blushed, panting. "Thank you." Again. She tried to steady herself. "I seem to keep needing you to save me." He gave a quiet laugh. "We save each other. That's how we'll survive." They pressed on. Hours passed, and the sun beat down. The island seemed larger than they first thought. By midday, they found a slight clearing on higher ground. Tired and hungry, they decided to rest there. Clara leaned against a crooked tree trunk. She felt an overwhelming desire to ask Charles about his family, about his own feelings regarding this feud. Curiosity gnawed at her, and she could not contain it anymore. "Charles," she began, hesitating. "All these years, our families have despised each other. Do you ever question if it's all based on misunderstandings?" He exhaled a heavy breath. "All the time. My father taught me that the Evans are our sworn enemies, that I should never let my guard down around your family. But being with you now, it makes me think there's more to the story." She nodded, feeling some relief to hear him voice it. "My father said similar things about the Armstrongs. He claimed you were ruthless and untrustworthy, but I never bought into all that. I thought maybe there were details he wasn't sharing." Charles stared into the distance, the swamp's surface reflecting the hazy sunlight. "In my family, there's a story that your grandfather tried to sabotage our tech patents. But I heard rumors that it was actually the other way around, that my grandfather did something shady first. I don't know the truth. Clara sighed. My father only told me that the Armstrongs tried to ruin our name in a big land deal decades ago. He said he would never forgive them. Silence settled. They both felt the weight of these old grudges. Here, stranded in the wilderness, it seemed ridiculous that their families clung to hatred. It had shaped so much of their lives, yet in this raw place, all that truly mattered was survival and each other. By late afternoon, clouds gathered again, threatening more rain. Clara and Charles hurried to gather branches and palm-like leaves for a better shelter. They had chosen this clearing because it was slightly elevated and offered some natural cover from overhead branches. As they worked side by side, they found themselves talking more freely. Clara spoke about her research in new chemical compounds for medical use. She wanted to create cheaper and more accessible treatments for children with neurological issues. Charles listened intently, asking questions and offering ideas. She was surprised by how knowledgeable he was. Charles then explained his own dream, to build a tech incubator that would fund projects aimed at helping underprivileged communities. He was tired of chasing profit for profit's sake. He wanted real impact. They were so different from the images each had been taught about the other. The more they spoke, the deeper their connection grew. Clara felt a growing sense of admiration for Charles, not just for his bravery, but for his ideals. She wondered if, under different circumstances, they might have been close all along. Night fell once more, and the sky opened up. Rain hammered their makeshift shelter. They huddled inside, using the broad leaves to keep most of the water out. Thunder grumbled in the distance, but at least it was not as fierce as before. The air cooled slightly, enough that a light shiver passed through Clara's body. Charles noticed. He moved closer, placing an arm around her to share warmth. She closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the moment. In the dim light, she could see the shadow of his face. His jaw was clenched in thought. She took a breath, mustering courage. Charles, I'm glad you're here with me. He turned to her, eyes reflecting something deep. I'm glad too, Clara. His voice was low and soft. I don't want to scare you off, but I can't stop thinking about you. Even before this, I'd seen you at events. I always found you different. Clara's heartbeat sped up. She swallowed, uncertain. Different how? You never seemed interested in flaunting wealth or playing the social games. You cared about real work and real change. It set you apart. I used to wonder what it would be like to talk to you without all the family drama. Her cheeks warmed at his honesty. She felt an urge to be equally open. I used to watch your interviews. I saw how you talked about using technology for human welfare. I thought you were genuine and driven, despite what my father said. But we never had a chance to speak, not properly. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. We do now. In the flickering lightning, she saw his face draw closer. The moment stretched, charged with an unspoken longing. Slowly, he lifted a hand to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her muddy skin. Her breath caught. She felt the rhythmic pounding of her heart, the electricity passing between them. Then, in a hesitant, tender motion, he pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft and brief, but it sent sparks through Clara's body. She felt the tension in his shoulders, the warmth of his hand on her waist. It was as if all the fear, worry, and exhaustion of the last 2 days melted away, replaced by a single, clear understanding. They had found each other in the darkest of times. When they broke apart, they stared into each other's eyes. Neither spoke. There was no need for words. Outside, the rain continued to beat down, but inside their small shelter, a fragile sense of hope blossomed. The next day, they rose early to search for anything that might help them signal a passing plane or ship. Charles suggested finding a high point to climb and see if they could spot any sign of civilization. After a small meal of sour fruit, they set off once more. It took them hours to find a tall, sturdy tree they could climb. Charles went up first, using twisted vines to pull himself higher and higher. Clara waited below, nerves on edge as she watched him. At last, He reached a high branch that let him see above the canopy. He scanned the horizon. After a few minutes, he called down to her. "Clara, I think I see smoke. It's faint, but it's that way." He pointed to the north. Hope flared in her chest. Smoke might mean people, or at least a place they could find resources. They decided to head north as far as daylight would allow. Their journey was fraught with muddy paths and tangled roots. They had to wade through chest-deep swamp water at one point, fending off biting insects. By late afternoon, they were close to the area Charles had spotted. But as they drew near, their excitement turned to alarm. Instead of a friendly camp or smoke from a small village, they found the remains of a burnt-out structure, half hidden by overgrown vines. The walls were scorched and the roof had collapsed. Ash and charred would litter the ground. Clara frowned at the strange sight. She wondered who had lived here and why it had burned. They poked around, searching for anything useful. They found scraps of metal, old tools that were rusted beyond use, and a few rotten boxes. In one corner, amid a collapsed beam, Clara found a small wooden chest. Its hinges were burnt, but it was still partly intact. Curiosity got the better of them. They forced it open, revealing a stack of old papers and a water-damaged journal. The pages were mostly ruined, the ink blurred, but a few entries were still readable. They saw dates from decades past and references to something called the Evant-Armstrong Agreement. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She and Charles exchanged a stunned look. Why were their family names in a journal in this remote place? "It looks like someone was studying or storing documents related to our families," Charles murmured. He flipped through the damaged pages. "I see mention of a large land sale. There's a note that says he blamed me for the downfall, but I know the truth. The Evans were set up by the Armstrongs. The child is—" He trailed off as the ink became too smeared to read. Clara's mind reeled. What child? What downfall? This is so strange. They found scattered references to a Raymond, her father's name, and notes that sounded like confessions or warnings. Many of the words were lost to damage, but it hinted at a deeper story of betrayal, one that might reveal the real cause of the feud. "I wonder if someone in our families came here, maybe on the run or in hiding," Clara said. Her voice hushed. "This place looks like it's been abandoned for a long time." Charles nodded, a grin set to his jaw. "It means our families have secrets we never knew. If we ever get off this island, we need to dig deeper." A sense of unease settled over them. They realized that the feud might be rooted in something far more twisted than mere business deals. Was there a scandal involving a hidden child? A betrayal that was blamed on someone else? The questions spun in their minds, mixing with the worry of how they would ever leave this place. They decided to keep the few legible papers from the chest. Maybe if they survived, they could show them to someone who could help piece the puzzle together. But for now, they needed to find a safe place to sleep again. Night was coming, and the burnt structure offered no protection. Reluctantly, they left the site, hearts heavy with uncertainty. Days blurred together. Clara and Charles roamed the island, surviving on small fruits, fish caught in shallow pools, and the water they found in fresh streams. Each night, they took shelter under trees or in natural alcoves to avoid the swamp creatures that crept around after dark. Despite the danger, they discovered warmth in each other's company. They shared stories, confessions, dreams. They grew closer than they had ever been to anyone else. On the fifth day, going by the rising and setting sun, they heard an engine humming overhead. They rushed to the clearing, waving frantically at a small plane that flew across the sky. But it was too high, and if anyone was looking down, they did not see the two figures on the ground. Hope faded as the plane disappeared beyond the clouds. Still, they refused to lose faith. Each sunrise brought renewed effort to look for ways off the island. They attempted to build a raft, but the muddy ground made gathering suitable with difficult. They vowed to keep trying. On what they guessed was the sixth day, as they were returning to their shelter spot, they heard a distant shout. Their heads whipped around. Then they saw it, a small boat, far out in the water. Someone was calling for them. Heart pounding, they raced to the shore. ignoring the sharp rocks and tangled weeds. As they drew closer, they recognized a man waving from the boat. It was Finn Marcotte, the Armstrong family's lawyer, and behind him were members of a search and rescue team. Relief flooded Clara. Rescue had come at last. They were helped onto the boat, given blankets and water. Clara clutched Charles's hand, feeling both joy and a strange sadness at leaving the island behind. A part of her had grown attached to the raw honesty they had shared there. She wondered if everything would be different once they returned to their families. Indeed, it proved to be a complicated homecoming. They were taken to a nearby coastal city, where they received medical checkups. News of their survival spread quickly. Both families arrived, overjoyed to see them safe. But tensions flared again when Raymond Evant set eyes on Charles Armstrong. Raymond rushed to embrace Clara, tears in his eyes. "My baby, I thought I lost you," he cried. Then he turned to glare on Charles. "What have you done to my daughter? If you think this experience will change anything between our families, you are mistaken." Clara stood in shock, so used to her father's abruptness that she hardly reacted. Charles, weary and fed up, defended himself calmly. "With respect, Mr. Evant, I helped keep your daughter alive. We took care of each other." Raymond fumed. "You probably had no choice if you wanted to survive. But do not think for a second that I will allow any closeness between you two. Our families remain at odds." Clara tried to interject. "Father, please. Charles and I." He cut her off. "We'll talk about this later, Clara. Right now, you need rest. Come, we're going back to the hotel." Charles watched as Raymond whisked Clara away. A tension in his chest made it hard to breathe. He had never felt such a strong longing for someone before. The island had changed him. He was not about to give Clara up so easily. Back in the city, the families took rooms at a luxury hotel. Clara felt overwhelmed by the sudden rush of normal life. Soft beds, hot showers, fine dining. It all seemed too much after the raw survival she and Charles had faced. She wanted time to sort out her feelings, but her father was determined to keep her under close watch. Raymond refused to let Charles near her. He barred any communication, telling Clara that Charles was just trying to manipulate her. At first, she obeyed in her weakened state, too tired to argue. But as the days passed, she grew restless. She needed to see Charles to talk about what had happened and what they had found in that burnt structure. However, her father cornered her each day with demands. He said that the Armstrongs were working to undermine the Evans once more. He had discovered that Charles was planning some big corporate move, or so the rumors claimed. Clara suspected it was more complicated than that. One evening, she slipped out of her room, heading to the hotel lobby. She checked the lounge, hoping to catch a glimpse of Charles. To her relief, she found him there, staring into a cup of tea. Her heart soared. She crossed the room quickly. "Charles," she said, breathless. "I'm sorry. My father's been." He stood, eyes softening at the sight of her. "Don't worry, I understand." He guided her to a private corner. "I've been trying to see you, but your father's guards keep me away." She nodded, tears threatening to spill. "He's afraid. He wants total control. He keeps saying I can't trust you, that your family is plotting something behind the scenes." A wry smile touched Charles's lips. "My father is doing the same. He claims that the Evans are about to sabotage our next big tech launch. I don't know where these rumors come from." He paused, placing a gentle hand over hers. "But I do know one thing. The documents we found on the island, they could hold answers." Clara squeezed his hand. "I still have them hidden in my things. We need someone to help us decode them or read the blurred text. Maybe an expert in document restoration." Charles nodded. "Yes, and we need to find out who wrote them. The mention of Raymond, it could be my father's father. Or it could be your father. We need clarity." They leaned closer, absorbing each other's presence. The memory of their days on the island felt distant now, but the bond they had formed was stronger than ever. In that moment, Raymond Evant appeared, flanked by two of his security men. His face was twisted with fury. Without warning, he grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her away from Charles. "I told you to stay away from him." Raymond hissed at her. Then he rounded on Charles. "And you, this is the last time you will lure my daughter away with your lies." Charles stood his ground, though he felt anger boil in his veins. "Mr. Evant, with respect, you can't keep her locked up. Clara has a right to make her own choices. She's not a child." Raymond barked a bitter laugh. "She is my child, and you are a threat to everything I have built." He turned to his security men. "Ensure Mr. Armstrong cannot bother us again." Before Charles could protest, he was escorted out of the hotel lounge by the security men. Clara watched, her heart in her throat. As he disappeared, she felt a sense of panic rise within her. Her father then led her away, gripped tight on her arm. She felt trapped again, just like in their old life, only now it felt more suffocating. Late that night, Clara wept in her hotel suite. She clutched the soaked documents they had rescued from the burnt structure. She wanted answers. She wanted freedom from this endless cycle of hatred. Most of all, she wanted to see Charles again, to hold him close without fear. Gathering her courage, she decided to run a quick internet search on the partial phrases they could still read. Evant Armstrong agreement child, downfall, blame. The results were scattered, references to old news articles and business archives. She dug deeper, searching each name carefully. One article mentioned a secret child born to a woman linked to both the Evant and Armstrong families. Another record hinted at hidden adoptions. The stories were murky, but Clara's stomach twisted as she realized that maybe her father or Charles's father had a sibling they never knew. The records were incomplete, yet it was enough to suspect that the real cause of this family feud might lie in some hidden lineage. The next morning, she confronted her father. She laid out the documents on a desk in their suite and demanded answers. Raymond Evant's face grew pale, then stony. "Where did you get these?" he snapped. "They're nonsense, Clara. Don't waste your time." But she could see the alarm in his eyes. "It's not nonsense. It connects our family and the Armstrongs to some hidden truth. Tell me, Dad, did you hide something from me all these years?" Raymond's lips tightened. "We had our reasons. The Armstrongs are not who they say they are. They cheated us. They destroyed lives. I protected you from that ugliness, but you insist on digging it up." She pressed on. "If you won't tell me, I'll find out myself. This might explain why you hate them so much. But I won't let it decide my life anymore." Her father's face twisted in rage. "I forbid you to meet Charles again. If you disobey me, I will cut you off from the family business, from everything. Do you understand?" Clara trembled with emotion. She felt trapped between loyalty to her father and the yearning for the truth. But she had come too far to back down. The island had shown her what real survival was like. She had faced danger head-on and lived. She could not let fear hold her back now. Her voice shook, but her words were firm. "I'm sorry, Father. I must do what's right." She turned and walked out, leaving him standing there, speechless. Clara contacted Charles, asking him to meet at a neutral place, an old cafe near the edge of the city. He arrived, relief clear on his face when he saw her. They sat in a dim corner, speaking in hushed tones. She showed him the partial research she had done. Together, they realized that the feud could be tied to a scandal involving a relative who might have been disowned or hidden. Perhaps that person was wronged by one family, then blamed the other. It was enough to start unraveling the lies. Charles told her of the big tech launch his father was planning. He was certain the rumors about an Evant sabotage were false. Meanwhile, Clara said that her father was sure the Armstrongs planned to ruin their next big real estate expansion. Both sides believed the worst of each other, kept alive by a rumor mill no one questioned. They decided to stand together, no matter the cost. "We have each other," Clara whispered, clasping Charles's hand. "That's what matters." He looked at her with fierce devotion. "I won't let our family's hatred tear us apart." From there, they formed a plan. They would use the few intact pages and hire a forensic document examiner to restore as much text as possible. Then they would gather both families and reveal the findings, forcing them to confront the truth. It was a bold move that could risk everything, but they had no choice if they wanted to heal the old wounds. Within 2 weeks, with the help of experts, Clara and Charles managed to piece together key lines from the old journal. It belonged to a man named Leonard Evant, Clara's grandfather's cousin. He wrote about a failed partnership with an Armstrong in which he lost everything. Distraught, Leonard claimed he was framed so that the Armstrong side could seize more land. But he also wrote that he had, in a moment of vengeance, falsified legal papers to make it appear that the Armstrongs had stolen from him. The result was a cycle of blame and hatred. A separate note mentioned a secret child born to Leonard's sister. It seemed that the child had ties to the Armstrong family as well. The details were fuzzy, but it was clear that both families had deeper connections than anyone realized. The entire story suggested a shared bloodline that might have bound the two families together instead of tearing them apart. With these revelations in hand, Clara and Charles called for a meeting. They booked a small conference room in a neutral location. At first, neither side wanted to attend, suspicious of a trap. But with Charles's father, Bryce Armstrong, curious about the mention of a hidden child, and with Raymond Evant suspecting a bluff, both men decided to show up. The tension in that room was thick as tar. Raymond Evant glared from one side of the table, while Bryce Armstrong sat on the other. Their lawyers and key family members flanked them. Clara and Charles stood at the head, side by side, hearts pounding. Charles began, "Thank you all for coming. We know this feud has run for generations. Today, we want to show you documents that might change everything." Raymond rolled his eyes. "I doubt that." Clara kept her voice steady. "We found a journal belonging to Leonard Evant. It shows that both our families shared blame in a major scandal. There were forgeries, stolen property, and a hidden child who may have been part of both lineages." She passed out copies of the restored pages. The room fell silent as everyone read. Shocked expressions replaced scorn. People whispered, pointing at the incriminating lines. Bryce Armstrong spoke first, voice trembling. "This is nonsense. Where did you get it?" Charles held his father's gaze. "We found the original documents in a burnt-out house on the island where we washed up. It was Leonard's last hiding place. He wrote it all down." Raymond's face paled. He had recognized Leonard's name. "Leonard was estranged from our family. My father said he disappeared. He believed the Armstrongs forced him out." Clara inhaled, trying to calm her racing heart. "But according to this, Leonard faked evidence. So your father believed the Armstrongs had cheated us. It was his twisted plan to strike back. At the same time, an Armstrong ancestor may have done something shady before that. Both sides carried out betrayals. That's how it spiraled." Bryce and Raymond read more, eyes clouded with confusion and anger. Then Charles took a step toward them. "Don't you see? We've all been pawns of old lies. This feud was built on misunderstandings and false charges. Maybe it started with a real slight, but it was twisted into something far bigger." A hush fell. The older men exchanged hard looks. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Raymond slammed his fist on the table. "Why bring this up now? What do you want?" Clara met his glare. "We want peace. We want our families to stop tearing each other apart. And we're not asking for permission to care about each other. We already do." Charles took her hand, facing the group. "We plan to rebuild what was lost. We want to combine resources to create something that helps others, something that can heal this hatred instead of feeding it." The lawyers began to protest, but Clara's voice rose. "If we keep fighting, we'll destroy ourselves. Don't you see? We have a chance to end this feud and do real good in the world. I know both families have philanthropic arms. Let's merge them. We can honor the memory of those who suffered in the past and help children with untreatable neurological conditions. My life's passion." The room erupted in argument. Some family members agreed, while others shouted about betrayals. But slowly, as they debated, it became clear that new evidence was too strong to ignore. The older generation had clung to bitterness, but the younger ones saw an opportunity for a fresh start. At last, Bryce Armstrong stood. "I propose we create a joint foundation, the Evant Armstrong Foundation. We will fund research and treatments for children, bridging advanced technology and advanced materials." Raymond Evan huffed, glaring at the pages one last time. He looked at his daughter, her fierce eyes. Then he turned to Charles, who stood tall but calm. A slight tremor flickered across Raymond's face. He had never intended to lose his daughter to the Armstrongs, but the proof of their shared history was undeniable. The old man let out a slow breath. "Fine," he muttered. "We can try. But mark my words, if you cross me, I'll—" Charles nodded grimly. "I understand, Mr. Evant. But we won't cross you. We want the same things now." Though uneasy, both sides shook hands. The old grudge was not gone overnight, but the truth had cracked its foundation. Something new was being born. Over the next few months, Clara and Charles worked tirelessly to turn their vision into reality. They led negotiations between both families, setting up the Evant Armstrong Foundation. Its mission was to research advanced treatments for children with severe neurological issues, combining Clara's specialized knowledge with Charles's tech resources. Many in the two families resisted at first, clinging to suspicion. But with time, they saw the benefits. Public opinion also shifted in favor of this bold act of unity. It became a symbol of reconciliation, proof that old feuds could be broken when truth and compassion prevailed. Meanwhile, Clara and Charles found a new rhythm in their personal life. Freed from the fear of immediate family retaliation, they dated openly. The press labeled them a power couple, but they ignored the hype. They cherished quiet nights at Clara's lab, brainstorming cures and therapies. Or they spent evenings at Charles's tech campus, walking hand in hand, dreaming of ways to help the less fortunate. Raymond Evant, still stiff with pride, tried to interfere at times. But after seeing how determined Clara was, he backed off. He remained watchful, though, reminding Charles that he would not tolerate any hint of betrayal. Charles, for his part, remained respectful, never giving the older man cause to doubt his intentions. Over countless meetings and dinners, they formed a cautious understanding. Bryce Armstrong also learned to accept Clara's presence in his son's life. He realized that bridging the gap with the Evans could lead to breakthroughs in the tech world. He admired Clara's mind, seeing how her research aligned with Charles's ambitions to make technology serve humanity. As the months passed, the foundation gained traction. They hired top scientists and doctors, funded by both families' wealth. Clinical trials began for new treatments, some showing promise that brought tears of joy to families struggling with devastating conditions. The media praised the surprising unity of the once feuding dynasties. A year after the island ordeal, Clara and Charles organized a special ceremony to dedicate the foundation's new research center. The building stood as a beacon of hope, sleek and modern, nestled in a park for families and children to enjoy. The entire Evant and Armstrong clans gathered, along with the press and local leaders. Clara took the stage first. She wore a simple white dress, her heart fluttering as she spoke. "A year ago, Charles and I were stranded on an island with no way out. We learned, in that harsh place, that survival depends on cooperation, not conflict. We also discovered truths about our family's pasts that were buried under hatred. Today, we stand together to show that unity can create a brighter future for those in need." Thunderous applause rang out. Next, Charles took the microphone. He wore a tailored suit, but his smile was warm and humble. He spoke of their journey, of the mistakes of previous generations, and of the power of compassion to heal wounds. As he finished, he turned to Clara, eyes shining. "And there's one last announcement," he said, voice trembling slightly. "Clara, you and I have walked through storms, both literal and emotional. We have faced dangers inside and out, but our bond only grew stronger. Will you?" He paused, dropping to one knee. The crowd gasped. Raymond Evant's eyes went wide, but even he seemed caught in the spell of the moment. "Will you marry me, Clara Evant? Will you stand by my side, helping me build a world where family feuds are overshadowed by hope and love?" Clara's heart soared. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she nodded before she could speak. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." She raised him up into a fierce embrace. The crowd erupted in cheers. Cameras flashed. People clapped and whistled. In the front row, Raymond Evans struggled to maintain a stoic face. Slowly, pride and maybe even joy replaced a scowl. Next to him, Bryce Armstrong looked on with a gentle smile. In that moment, all the strife and pain fell away. It did not vanish forever. Healing old wounds was a process. But on that day, under the golden sun, Clara and Charles sealed their love. They had chosen each other despite the storms and the grudges. They had carved a path toward unity and hope, forging a legacy that was bigger than both family shadows. Months later, the Evant Armstrong Foundation had already made headlines for breakthroughs in neurological therapies for children. The combined wealth, along with Clara's and Charles's leadership, fueled rapid progress. The two families continued to navigate old tensions, but conversations replaced accusations, and shared purpose replaced suspicion. Clara and Charles married in a private ceremony by the sea, a quiet, intimate affair to honor the place where they had nearly lost everything, but ended up finding each other. They recited vows that spoke of honesty, perseverance, and love stronger than fear. Raymond gave his daughter away with shaky hands, swallowing his pride for the sake of her happiness. Bryce stood as Charles's witness, tears bright in his eyes. News of their union spread, praised by some, questioned by others. But for Clara and Charles, what mattered was that they had broken the cycle of hatred. They had found truth in each other, a truth powerful enough to bind them for life. Occasionally, they thought back to the swampy island, the terror of the nights, the sticky heat, the sense of lurking danger. Yet they also recalled how it felt to cling to one another under the stars, how their hearts pounded with both fear and a fresh spark of love. That experience became a symbol of their resilience. The island had tested them in ways few could understand, but it had also awakened them to what truly mattered. They had discovered that they could triumph over any storm, armed with nothing more than faith in each other and the shared desire to do good. And they moved forward side by side, unstoppable in their devotion to both love and a new world shaped by unity, compassion, and hope.